They were once the most feared men in Europe. But after the fall of the Third Reich, power became fear and pride became shame. And suddenly the weight of history weighed down on their uniforms. The air in Berlin was heavy with smoke from burning files, while the footsteps of generals echoed through bombed-out corridors. In the final days of the Third Reich, their medals lay like worthless rubble on desks that soon no longer belonged to them. The Reich had fallen, the capital a field of rubble. But for the men who had commanded Hitler's war machine, an even darker phase now began. The path from commander to prisoner. Adolf Hitler's last days in the bunker were characterized by madness, mistrust, and loneliness. The chain of command crumbled around him. Some generals had already committed suicide. Others tried to escape or evade the threat of responsibility. But for many, the path out of the Führer's shadow was impossible. Wilhelm Keitel, head of the High Command of the Wehrmacht, was one of the men who signed orders that led to the deaths of thousands of civilians right up to the end. In the days after the surrender, he was arrested by the Allies, with a straight back but a blank stare. Together with him, Alfred Jodl, a man without a big name among the population, but crucial in the planning of war crimes. They would soon become key figures in the first international military tribunal in history, Nuremberg. Courtroom 600 in the Palace of Justice. The eyes of the world were on this stage. Cameras clicked while Jodl adjusted his headphones, and Keitel sat stiffly next to him. It was not just a trial. It was a confrontation with the question, can duty take precedence over morality? Prosecutor Jackson, U.S. Chief Prosecutor, looked over his glasses as he said, "These men didn't just sign orders, they signed the deaths of millions." Jodl defended himself with cool objectivity. "I was a soldier. I carried out orders." Keitel, steeped in education and discipline, invoked the same line. Obedience, orders, reason of state. But the tribunal did not accept this defense. The so-called Befehls not stand thesis, i.e., acting out of obedience to duty, was rejected. Every person, including a general, had the moral responsibility to disobey criminal orders. This decision would later become the basis for all future international trials of war criminals. The facts. Keitel had supported the Commissar orders that allowed systematic shootings of Soviet officers. He signed directives justifying hostage shootings and mass deportations. Jodl authorized terror orders in occupied territories, such as Norway, measures that included arbitrary executions. They did not stand for tactics. They stood for bureaucratic cruelty in the service of a regime. Visual scene. A British officer opens a metal case during a break in the trial. Inside, documents with Jodl's signature, orders stamped for official use only, outlined in red. A cameraman zooms in on the handwriting, angular, clear, unmistakable. The verdicts. On October 1st, 1946, the verdict was handed down. Keitel, death by hanging. Jodl, death by hanging. The night before his execution, Jodl wrote a final letter to his wife. "I have given my life to the fatherland. I don't know whether the fatherland will recognize that." Keitel remained military to the end. He saluted the gallows. When he fell, it was quiet in the room. But not everyone experienced this outcome. Other generals were waiting in the detention cells, with trembling hands, averted eyes, empty chairs beside them. They knew mercy was rare, forgetting impossible. And outside, in the ruins of Munich, Dresden, Hamburg, people looked at newspapers printing the sentences. Some nodded, others remained silent, And some wondered, was this justice, or just the beginning of a much bigger reckoning? Some wore uniforms, others wore knowledge, and sometimes knowledge was more valuable than justice. After the shock of Nuremberg, after the fall of the gallows, an uncomfortable question remained. What to do with the men who fought for the Third Reich, but who possessed indispensable knowledge? Heinz Guderian was one of these men. Architect of the German Blitzkrieg doctrine, pioneer of armored warfare. In the early years of the war, he was considered unstoppable. Poland, France, the Soviet Union, everywhere his divisions rolled through defensive lines that were supposedly impregnable. His reputation, a brilliant strategist, but also a convinced National Socialist. After the war, one would have expected to see him in the same courtroom as Keitel or Jodl. But that didn't happen. Why? Guderian was interned after the end of the war, but not charged. Instead, he was questioned at length, again and again, by British and American officers, about tactics, logistics, personnel management, about the strengths and weaknesses of the Wehrmacht, and about the men he had served with. The Allies, especially the Americans, were already in the shadow of a new conflict, the Cold War. And suddenly, a Guderian was no longer just seen as an enemy, but as a potential resource. A man who could help build a new German army against the Soviets. Visual scene. An interrogation room in a military base near Frankfurt. Guderian, in civilian clothes, sits in front of a pile of maps. A U.S. officer points to the Smolensk-Kursk line. Guderian taps on a spot with a pen. Here we underestimated how deeply they were prepared. The camera pans to the officer's gaze. Respect, but no sympathy. Guderian was officially spared charges. Instead, he was later called in as an advisor when the Bundeswehr was formed, the new army of the Federal Republic. In his memoirs, he stylized himself as a pure soldier without political responsibility. But historians still argue today about how deep his loyalty to the Nazi regime really went. Another case. Erich von Manstein, a brilliant general, responsible for the fall of France in 1940, a master of operational warfare. But unlike Guderian, Manstein was put on trial in Hamburg under British jurisdiction. Among other things, he was accused of tolerating massacres of civilians in the occupied Soviet territories and supporting Einsatzgruppen. The sentence, 18 years in prison, but Manstein only spent 4 of them in prison. Why this leniency? Again, it was the Cold War that decided over justice. In 1953, at the height of tensions with the Soviet Union, Manstein was released, officially for health reasons. Unofficially, because they wanted his expertise. He was consulted again in West German military circles. His books were published and read, even in NATO. His influence remained subtle but noticeable. A quote from his autobiography, "I never acted against my conscience, but I also never forgot that the soldier serves the state, not morality." One moment. Manstein, a few months after his release, stands in a garden. He is wearing a dark coat and smoking a cigarette. A reporter approaches and asks a question about the trials. Manstein does not answer. He looks into the distance and remains silent. Post-war society in West Germany had a hard time with men like this. On the one hand, they were seen as military experts at a time when people wanted to show their strength again. On the other hand, they were tainted by the blood of the past. A dilemma. Was it legitimate to use knowledge gained under a murderous regime? Could a man like Guderian be trusted just because he was good at what he did. Rhetorical question. If a general can win wars but fights for an unjust regime in the process, is he a hero or an accomplice? History gave no clear answer, and perhaps therein lies its dark truth. They did not return, not to their homes, not to their families. Some never returned at all, except as shadows. While Western generals such as Manstein and Guderian were interrogated or even rehabilitated, the German officers who were taken prisoner by the Soviets faced a completely different fate, one of cold, hunger, and silence. The most prominent among them, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus. In January 1943, at the height of the Battle of Stalingrad, Paulus was faced with the decision of his life. The Sixth Army was surrounded, supplied only by a fragile airlift system that hardly deserved the name. The soldiers suffered from typhus, frostbite, and hunger. The Soviet guns pounded incessantly. Hitler's orders were clear. Don't surrender. Hold out, to the last man. Paulus hesitated. He was not a fanatical Nazi, but a man of discipline. But his officers asked him to do the inevitable. Surrender. On January 31st, 1943, he finally laid down his arms, the first field marshal in German history ever to surrender. Visual scene. A trembling Paulus in uniform, surrounded by Soviet officers. His eyes are sunken, his lips pale. He hands over his pistol, slowly, as if in slow motion. The camera zooms in on his hands, which are chapped from the cold. For Stalin, Paul was a gift, a symbol of the turning point of the war. But he didn't treat him like a hero. He treated him like an object. Paul was interned in Moscow, then transferred to various camps, including Krasnogorsk near Moscow. Years passed. Paul spent almost a decade in Soviet captivity, not tortured, but controlled. His letters were censored, his movements restricted, his function a walking memorial. He was allowed to speak at press conferences about the insanity of the war, about the mistakes of the Wehrmacht. Some saw this as genuine purification, others thought it was staging. But what was going on inside him? That remained uncertain. An entry from his notes, 1948. I was a general. Now I am a character. The uniform is gone, but the guilt remains. Meanwhile, of the approximately 90,000 German soldiers who were captured by the Soviets in Stalingrad, around 83,000 died. Exhaustion, disease, malnutrition. The Soviet camps were not concerned with humanitarian standards. In places like Beketovka, Suzdal, or Tambov, the men suffered in cold barracks, often without medical care. One moment, a former Wehrmacht officer describes after his return, "We learned to eat snow, not to survive, but to numb the hunger for an hour." Paulus survived. In 1953, after Stalin's death, he was released. He did not return to the West, but settled in Dresden, in the GDR. He lived there relatively inconspicuously. He worked as a military historian, wrote memoirs, and occasionally appeared at events. But he remained broken, physically and mentally. His death. Friedrich Paulus died of cancer in 1957 alone, without public ceremony, in a hospital that referred to him only as Dr. Friedrich Paulus. His grave, simple, surrounded by trees, far away from the noise of history. But he was not the only one. Other generals, such as Walter von Seydlitz and Arno Schmidt, also spent years in Soviet captivity. Some collaborated, some resisted, many broke up. The contrast was cruel. While Guderian was developing military concepts in West Germany, another general was freezing in a barrack near Vladimir, not knowing whether he would ever be allowed to write a letter again. The Red Army did not forgive. For the Soviet leadership, every German officer was a potential traitor or a potential bargaining chip. Mercy was not a concept. Justice, another word for retribution. Rhetorical question. Where is there more guilt, in command or in obedience? And what if obedience survives, but the person breaks? Part 3 ends with a picture of a yellowed portrait of Paul standing on a desk in Dresden. Next to it, a tattered Bible, and a black and white photo of Stalingrad. Half in the fire, half in the snow. Some didn't die because they were guilty, but because they could no longer remain silent. Not every German general at the end of the war was unconditionally loyal to Hitler. Some doubted, out of tactical calculation, moral ambivalence, or personal despair. But in a regime that saw doubt as betrayal, even hesitation was life-threatening. Erwin Rommel was one of the best-known names in the Wehrmacht. Desert Fox, revered for his military successes in North Africa. Brave, fast, unorthodox. Even Churchill once spoke of him with respect. Rommel was considered a man of honor, the Prussian ideal, loyal but not fanatical, patriotic but not ideologically blinded. But in 1944, Rommel was no longer the celebrated general. He was back in Germany, badly wounded after an air raid and deeply embroiled in internal conflicts. The July 20th conspiracy, an assassination attempt on Hitler, Stauffenberg, Ulbricht, Beck. They were not just planning an attack, but a coup d'etat. Rommel was not part of the inner circle, but he knew about it, and he kept quiet. That alone was enough. The Gestapo investigated. Names were named under torture. Rommel also fell, indirectly. Hitler was fuming, but he knew that a trial against Rommel would be a PR disaster. The celebrated general, the hero of Africa, publicly exposed as a traitor, unacceptable. So another solution was found. On October 14, 1944, a black car drove into Rommel's hometown of Herrlingen. 2 generals got out. They delivered the message. Rommel had to choose one of 2 options, either a public trial with all the consequences, or an honorary death by his own hand. In return, his family would be spared, his reputation would be preserved, and his funeral would take place with military honors. Visual scene. Rommel is standing in the garden of his house. Autumn leaves lie on the gravel path. In his right hand is a glass of clear liquid, cyanide. He is not looking at the glass, but into the distance. His wife is watching him from the window. Her lips are not moving. Her eyes are moist. Rommel dies a few minutes later in a military vehicle. Officially, a heart attack. But the truth leaks out. People whisper in Herrlingen. The family remained silent. The Wehrmacht honored him with a state funeral. Hitler sends a wreath. And the myth begins. Rommel, the good face of the Wehrmacht. Another case, Günther von Kluge, field marshal on the Western Front. Also involved in the attempted coup. Also wavering, hesitating, inwardly torn. He was recalled after the failed assassination attempt. Days later, he took his own life. He also left behind a farewell letter, containing words such as honor, responsibility, but also despair. What remains of such men? The post-war period needed heroes, at least tragic ones. Rommel became a symbol of military decency, of internal opposition, of the other Germany. His biographies filled bookshelves. Streets were named after him, but historians warn against romanticizing him. Rommel served until the end. He profited from the system. He remained silent about the crimes in North Africa. His resistance, half-hearted, late, inconsistent. Rhetorical question. Is doubt enough to erase complicity? Does a follower become a hero just because he says no too late? History is not a courtroom. It judges quietly, often ambiguously, But it does not forget. One moment, Rommel's uniform hangs in a museum in Ulm, neatly pressed under glass. Next to it is a picture. Rommel with his son Manfred, laughing. Underneath is a sentence. He was my father, and he died for something he never named out loud. Part 4 does not end with a verdict, but with a blank space, the place that heroes should occupy, and the question of whether shadows are allowed to live there. Justice is not a judgment. It is a struggle between memory, interest, and forgetting. The final years after the war brought no clear line. While some generals were hanged, others were used, and some were glorified as martyrs. A tough, politically charged shadow loomed over post-war Germany. How to deal with those who had not only waged wars, but also shaped history. Two names in particular embody this contradictory phase: Albert Kesselring and Karl Dönitz. Albert Kesselring was one of the last active commanders of the Wehrmacht, commander in Italy, responsible for brutal reprisals against partisans and civilians. In March 1944, for example, he indirectly ordered the reprisals at the Ardeatine caves. 35 men were shot, many of them chosen at random. He was not a desk officer, but a man of the front, known for his toughness. After the end of the war, he was sentenced to death by a British military court in Venice for war crimes. But the sentence was not carried out. The West German government intervened, prominent voices protested. It was said that Kesselring was ill, an old soldier with no relevance today. The sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. In 1952, after only 6 years, he was released. He returned home to applause from conservative circles. Shortly afterwards, he published a book entitled Soldier to the Last Day. No admission of guilt in it, no doubt, just military discipline. Visual scene. A man in a dark suit gets out of a car in a small Bavarian town. Cameras click, a crowd applauds. Kesselring smiles, waves, briefly raises his hand in greeting. No remorse, only pride. Karl Dönitz, the last president of the Third Reich after Hitler's death, was previously commander-in-chief of the Navy. Under him, the submarine war was waged against Allied supply lines, ruthlessly, often in defiance of the law of the sea. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison in Nuremberg. His defense: the Allies had also waged ruthless warfare at sea. Partly successful, the judges actually differentiated between political and military crimes. Dönitz was released from the war crimes prison in Spandau in 1956 without a public apology. He later wrote his memoirs. In it, he saw himself as a patriot, not a perpetrator. Rhetorical question: when someone gives the orders, but believes he is acting for the fatherland, where does duty end? Where does guilt begin? The wider context. In the 1950s, the Allies and the young Federal Republic faced a dilemma. How much of the past can a new state bear without breaking up over it? The Cold War demanded clear fronts, and suddenly old enemies became new players. The rearmament of the FRG, the development of the Bundeswehr, all this happened with the involvement of former Wehrmacht officers. Not all of them, but many. The goal was stability, the price, silence. But not everyone remained silent. Holocaust survivors, historians, and journalists began to ask questions. In the 1960s, the first trials against SS officers began: documentaries, books, witness reports. Slowly, the process of coming to terms with the past began. But the generals? Many died in old people's homes, with medals in their closets, their deeds, in the mists of history. One last look. An empty courtroom in Nuremberg, deserted. The wooden benches dull, the microphone dusty. Sunlight falls through the windows. dust dances in the air. The place where, for the first time in the history of the world, power did not triumph but had to declare itself. And yet the question remains, was it justice or political necessity? The fates of German generals after the war are not a judgment. They are a mirror for guilt, for opportunism, for humanity, and for its limits. Because history does not end with a verdict. It only begins there.